Do you believe you know the person you married? Michelle believed it too, until she received a call that changed everything. The events department of her husband's company called to inform her that her name had been removed from the guest list for the annual party. The reason? It was her own husband who requested it. He didn't want anyone to know that he was married, but that was just the tip of the iceberg of a much bigger lie. How many times have you wondered if you really know the person who sleeps next to you every night? Michelle lived 10 years of marriage believing she knew Brian completely. She trusted him like we trust the air we breathe, until a simple phone call destroyed that illusion forever. You know what's scarier than discovering that your partner lies? It's discovering that you've been erased from his life as if you never existed. While Michelle thought she was building a life alongside her husband, he was building a completely different life away from her. The story you're going to hear today will make you question everything you believe you know about relationships. Because sometimes, the people closest to us are precisely those who keep the most painful secrets. Michelle discovered that she wasn't just a neglected wife. She was a secret that Brian actively hid from the world. Imagine discovering that the person who promised to love you forever is ashamed for other people to know that you're married. Imagine discovering that while you proudly introduce your husband to everyone, he pretends to be single to his coworkers. That's exactly what happened to Michelle. This isn't just a story about lies. It's a story about how some people manage to live two completely different lives at the same time. And about how a woman had to choose between accepting being a secret or fighting for her own freedom. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching us from? I'd love to know where you're following this story from. Michelle was organizing the kitchen drawers when the phone rang. It was a regular Thursday afternoon, one of those where the biggest event of the day would be deciding whether to make lasagna or chicken for dinner. She wiped her hands on the dish towel and answered without hurry. Hello? Hi, can I speak with Michelle Johnson? The voice was feminine, professional, with that polite tone that usually means a work call. That's me. Perfect. My name is Amanda. I work in the events department at Tech Solutions. I'm calling about our annual party that's happening on Saturday, the 15th. Michelle stopped organizing the drawer. Tech Solutions was the company where Brian had worked for 5 years. Why would someone from there be calling her? I think there's been some mistake. I don't work at Tech Solutions. I know. Amanda laughed gently. You're on our list as Brian Johnson's spouse. I'm confirming your attendance and giving you some information about the event. For a moment, Michelle thought she had heard wrong. Spouse? List? Party? Sorry, but I think there really has been a misunderstanding. Brian never invited me to any company party. There was a pause on the other side of the line. Michelle could hear the sound of papers being shuffled. How strange. Your name has been here on the list since last month. The new HR system automatically generated the invitations, including all the spouses of married employees. Michelle sat down in the kitchen chair. In the 5 years that Brian had worked at Tech Solutions, she had never participated in any company event. Whenever she asked about parties or gatherings, Brian said they were only for employees or that they would be too boring for her to bother with. Are you sure my name is on the list? Absolutely. Michelle Johnson, spouse of Brian Johnson, Finance Department. Actually, I need to confirm if you have any dietary restrictions for dinner. Michelle felt her heart beating faster. Finally, she would meet Brian's colleagues. She would see where he worked, how he behaved in the professional environment, all those things that were part of his life, but always seemed like forbidden territory to her. I don't have any restrictions. Can you give me more details about the event? Amanda explained that it would be at the Marriott Hotel downtown, starting at 7 in the evening, semi-formal dress code. There would be dinner, some company presentations, and then live music. Michelle wrote everything down carefully, already imagining what outfit she would wear. One last thing, Amanda added. If there's any problem, or if you can't attend, please let me know by tomorrow so we can adjust the number of seats. After she hung up, Michelle sat in the kitchen, still processing the conversation. Why hadn't Brian mentioned anything? Could it be that he didn't know about this new HR system either? She looked at the clock. Brian would arrive in 2 hours. Michelle decided to make her special lasagna to celebrate. Finally, she would be included in his professional life. When Brian got home, Michelle was taking the lasagna out of the oven. The smell of melted cheese and seasoned tomato sauce filled the kitchen. "Wow, that smells good. What are we celebrating?" Brian asked, giving her a kiss on the cheek. "Actually, we do have something to celebrate," Michelle said, smiling. "I got an interesting call today." "Oh yeah, from who?" "Amanda, from the events department at Tech Solutions." Michelle saw Brian stop loosening his tie. His expression changed instantly, as if someone had pressed a panic button. "Amanda called? Why?" "About the company party on Saturday. Apparently, HR automatically included all spouses on the guest list this year." "What?" Brian dropped his briefcase on the floor. "They did what?" Michelle frowned. "Why are you reacting like this? It's good news, isn't it? I'll finally meet your colleagues." Brian ran his hand through his hair, a gesture Michelle knew well. He only did that when he was very nervous or worried. "It's just that this must be some system error," Brian said quickly. "You know how these technology things sometimes malfunction." "Error." Amanda said they used the information from employees' personal files, the documents you submitted when you were hired. "But I never authorized this," Brian protested. "They can't just include you without asking me first." Michelle felt a chill in her stomach. "Brian, why are you talking like this is a bad thing? We're married. It's natural for me to be included in your company events." "It's not a bad thing. It's just that—" Brian hesitated, searching for words. "It's just that I didn't know you had been included. If I had known, I would have told you beforehand." "Told me about what? That I was invited to your company party?" Michelle felt a pang of irritation growing. "Or, Brian, why are you reacting like this is a problem?" "It's not a problem," Brian said, but his voice didn't convince even himself. "It's just that these parties are pretty formal, pretty boring. Just work talk and—" "And what?" Michelle interrupted him. "Brian, in the 5 years you've worked there, I've never met even one of your colleagues. Not one. You know the people from my old job, which you left 5 years ago." Michelle slammed the wooden spoon on the counter. "Brian, how many times have I asked about your work? How many times have I said I'd like to meet the people you spend 8 hours a day with?" Brian remained silent. "How many times have you included me in anything related to Tech Solutions?" Silence. "I've been your wife for 5 years, Brian. Why do I have the feeling that I'm a secret in your professional life?" "You're not a secret," Brian protested, but there was something in his voice that sounded desperate. "It's just that I like to keep things separate. Work is work. Home is home." "Separate to what extent?" Michelle asked. And for the first time in years, she felt like she was seeing Brian with different eyes. "Because do your colleagues at least know that you're married?" Brian opened his mouth to answer, but no sound came out. Michelle felt the ground disappearing from under her feet. "Brian, do your colleagues know you're married?" "Of course they know," Brian answered, but he took too long to respond. "Then why are you so nervous about the idea of me meeting them?" "I'm not nervous. You dropped your briefcase on the floor when I mentioned the party." Brian ran his hand over his face. "Look, if it's so important to you, then let's go to the party. But I'll call Amanda tomorrow to confirm there was no error." To confirm there was no error in including me on the list. To confirm the event details. Michelle looked at her husband and felt like she was seeing a stranger. In 5 years of marriage, she had never seen Brian so uncomfortable, so evasive. "You were going to cancel my attendance, weren't you?" Michelle asked softly. "I wasn't going to cancel anything. If I hadn't received that call today, you would have called Amanda tomorrow to take me off the list." Brian didn't respond, but the answer was written on his face. Michelle felt tears burning her eyes. "Why, Brian? Why are you so ashamed of me?" "I'm not ashamed of you." "Then explain it to me. Explain to me why, in 5 years, you've never included me in anything related to your work. Explain to me why you're terrified of the idea of your colleagues meeting me." Brian stood in the middle of the kitchen, like a fish out of water. Michelle wiped the tears with the back of her hand. "You know what? I'm going to the party, Brian, with you or without you. Because after 5 years of being treated like I don't exist in your professional life, I deserve to at least meet the people my husband works with." That night, they ate dinner in silence. The lasagna was perfect, but Michelle could barely eat. Brian tried to make conversation a few times, talking about the weather, about a bill that had arrived, about anything that wasn't Saturday's party. When they went to bed, Michelle lay awake looking at the ceiling. Small things began to make sense. How Brian never received work calls at home. How he never mentioned specific names of colleagues. How he always changed the subject when she asked about his day at the office. Michelle turned to observe Brian sleeping beside her. For the first time in 5 years, she wondered, who really is the man I married? Have you ever had that disturbing feeling of discovering that you don't know someone as well as you thought, especially someone very close to you? Leave in the comments if you've ever been through a situation where you felt your partner was hiding an important part of their life from you. Michelle's story will show that sometimes the secrets people keep are much worse than we imagine. If you're feeling connected to this story, leave a like to help me, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications, because in the next chapter, Michelle will discover that her suspicions are just the tip of the iceberg of something much bigger. Michelle woke up Friday morning with a strange feeling in her chest. Brian was no longer in bed when she opened her eyes. She heard the sound of the shower in the bathroom and remembered the tense conversation from the night before. That whole story about the company party still bothered her. She got up, made coffee, and tried to organize her thoughts. Maybe she had overreacted. Maybe Brian really was just reserved about work. But something inside her whispered that there was more behind his resistance. Brian came down for coffee in silence. They exchanged few words, just what was necessary about the day's plans. When he left for work, Michelle noticed he seemed more tense than usual. She spent the morning trying to distract herself, organizing the house, making some calls to friends. But the feeling that something wasn't right wouldn't leave her. It was as if she had discovered a missing piece of a puzzle, but still couldn't see the complete picture. Around 2 in the afternoon, the phone rang. "Hello? Michelle? It's Amanda again, from Tech Solutions." Michelle smiled, thinking it might be some additional detail about the party. "Hi, Amanda. How are you? Look, I'm very sorry, but I need to inform you about a change." Amanda's voice sounded extremely embarrassed. "Your name has been removed from the guest list." Michelle felt like she had been punched in the stomach. "Removed? Why?" "It was your husband who requested it. Brian called this morning, asking to cancel your participation." The world around Michelle went silent. She could only hear the sound of her own heart beating in her chest. "O'Brien called?" "Yes. Early this morning. He said you wouldn't be able to attend the event. I'm very sorry for the inconvenience, and I apologize for calling yesterday without him having told you beforehand." When Amanda hung up, Michelle stood in the kitchen, holding the phone. Brian had called to cancel her attendance this morning. After leaving home without saying a word about it, Michelle tried to process what had happened. Last night, after all that conversation, Brian had agreed that they would go to the party. She had gone to sleep thinking maybe she had overreacted. And this morning, he woke up, showered, had coffee with her, and then called to cancel her attendance without saying anything. The betrayal wasn't just in the cancellation. It was in the fact that he had done it behind her back, as if she were a child who didn't deserve to participate in decisions that affected her own life. Michelle looked at the clock. 3 hours until Brian got home. 3 hours to decide how she was going to approach this. Part of her wanted to call him immediately and confront him over the phone. But another part wanted to see if he would come home and tell her what he had done, or if he would pretend nothing had happened. She spent the next few hours in a mixture of anger and sadness. Anger at the lie, sadness at discovering that maybe she didn't know the man she had married as well as she thought. When Brian arrived home at 6, Michelle was in the living room watching television. He greeted her normally, as if it were any other day. "Hi, honey. How was your day?" Brian asked, loosening his tie. Michelle turned off the television and turned to look at him. "Interesting," Amanda called. Brian's reaction was immediate. He stopped mid-movement. his tie still halfway undone. Amanda called? Yes, to inform me that my name was removed from the guest list for the party. Michelle stood up and walked until she was facing him. She said you called this morning to cancel my participation. Brian slowly lowered his hands. Michelle, you called this morning, Michelle repeated, her voice getting colder. And after leaving home without saying a word about it, I can explain. Can you? Michelle crossed her arms. Because I'm very curious to hear how you explain canceling my attendance at an event without consulting me. Brian ran his hand through his hair, that nervous gesture she knew well. It's just that I thought better about the whole situation. You thought better, Michelle interrupted. Alone? And decided it would be better for me not to go. It's not the way you're thinking. Then how is it? Her voice began to rise. Explain it to me, Brian, because I really don't understand. Look, after our conversation yesterday, I realized that maybe you were right about these parties being complicated. Michelle stared at him, incredulous. I never said it would be complicated. I said I wanted to meet your colleagues, but you said I was hiding you. And you are, Michelle exploded. And the proof is that you canceled my attendance secretly. Brian fell silent, without arguments. You know what's most painful about all this, Michelle continued, her voice trembling. It's not even the fact that you canceled. It's the fact that you lied to me this morning. I didn't lie. You didn't. Michelle approached him. You sat at the breakfast table with me, said goodbye normally, and didn't say a word about having canceled my attendance at the party. If that's not lying, what is? Brian opened his mouth, but no words came out. When were you going to tell me, Brian? Or were you going to let me find out on my own? His silence was more revealing than any confession. My God, Michelle whispered. You really were going to let me find out on my own. Michelle, I was trying to avoid conflict. Avoid conflict, she laughed, but there was no humor in the laugh. Secretly canceling your wife's attendance is avoiding conflict. I just thought it would be easier. Easier for whom? Brian. For you. Michelle felt angry, tears burning her eyes. Are you so ashamed of me that you'd rather cancel me than introduce me to your colleagues? I'm not ashamed of you. Then what is it? Michelle shouted. Explain to me why you do everything to keep me away from your professional life. Brian stood still, looking at her like a cornered animal. You can't explain, Michelle said, her voice becoming dangerously low, because you know I've discovered the truth. What truth? That you live two different lives. One here at home, where you pretend to be a normal husband, and another at work, where I don't exist. The words hung in the air between them like an accusation that couldn't be undone. They ate dinner in absolute silence that night. Each forkful was loaded with tension. Michelle looked at Brian and wondered how long he had been hiding her, and more importantly, why. When they went to bed, Michelle lay with her back to Brian, creating a physical barrier that mirrored the emotional one that had formed between them. In the darkness of the room, a question hammered in Michelle's mind. If Brian was capable of lying so easily about something like this, what other lies was he telling? Michelle spent the weekend in a fog of confusion and hurt. Brian tried to act normally, but there was a tension in the air that neither of them could ignore. On Monday morning, after Brian left for work, Michelle went to the shelf where they kept the family photos. She began flipping through the albums, looking for something she didn't exactly know what it was. But as she turned the pages, a pattern began to emerge. There were dozens of photos of social events throughout their 5 years of marriage. Parties, barbecues, weddings. In all of them, Michelle was beside Brian. But now, looking with different eyes, she began to remember the details she had ignored. Michelle remembered Brian's cousin's wedding 2 years ago. A man approached to greet Brian. Brian, good to see you here, the man said. Hi, Tom. How are you? This is Michelle. This is Michelle. Not, this is my wife. Just, this is Michelle, as if she were just any friend. Her best friend's birthday, 6 months ago. Someone asked how they met. We met through mutual friends, Brian answered, without mentioning they were married. Why didn't he simply say, "We're married"? The barbecue at the neighbor's house last month. Brian introduced her as Michelle, a very special person to me. Very special. As if they had been dating for a short time. Michelle closed the album. How had she not noticed this before? How had she normalized the fact that her own husband never referred to her as his wife in public? She tried to remember any occasion when Brian had clearly introduced her as his wife to strangers. She couldn't. There were always those vague introductions. This is Michelle. Michelle, a very special person. Never, my wife. Michelle remembered a Christmas party last year. Brian talked to everyone, was charismatic and funny. But when people asked about Michelle, he gave evasive answers. Michelle works in marketing. She lives here in the city. Never, my wife works in marketing. Michelle remembered feeling like a companion, like a person who was there by chance, not as the wife. At the time, she thought she was being too sensitive. Now she realized her intuition was right. There was another pattern too. At social events, Brian tended to move away from her after the initial introductions. Michelle frequently found herself alone, looking for Brian in the crowd. She always thought he was just being sociable. But now she wondered if he was intentionally creating distance so people wouldn't realize they were a couple. Michelle picked up the phone and called her best friend, Jessica. "Jess, have you ever noticed anything strange about the way Brian introduces me to people?" "Strange how?" "Like he never says I'm his wife. He always introduces me just by name." There was a pause. "Now that you mention it, I really never heard him call you his wife in front of other people." "Did you find that strange?" "To be honest, I always did. A man who's proud of his wife wants everyone to know she's his wife." After she hung up, Michelle felt validated and devastated at the same time. Brian didn't just hide the marriage from work colleagues, he hid the marriage from everyone. Michelle looked at the ring on her finger. For 5 years, she had worn that ring with pride. But now she wondered if Brian saw his ring the same way, or if for him it was just an object he tolerated wearing. The question that haunted Michelle the most was, why would someone get married if they were ashamed to admit they were married? Have you ever noticed a strange pattern in your partner's behavior that only made sense after you stopped to analyze it? Sometimes, our intuition picks up things that our rational mind takes time to process. Tell me in the comments if you've ever been through a similar situation, because Michelle's story will show that when we start connecting the dots, we discover truths that can change everything. That same afternoon, after the revealing conversation with Jessica, Michelle decided to investigate further. The question about why someone would get married if they were ashamed to admit the marriage wouldn't leave her head. Maybe social media could give some clues. Michelle picked up the laptop and opened Brian's Facebook. They had been friends on the platform for years, but she rarely paid attention to what he posted. Brian was never very active on social media, but occasionally shared some things. She began scrolling through his timeline, looking for photos or posts that mentioned their marriage. What she found left her cold. There were no photos of the two of them together. None. In 5 years of marriage, Brian had never posted a single photo of them as a couple. Michelle checked the photos he had been tagged in. There were some photos from events where they were together, but always posted by other people. And when Brian was tagged in those photos, he never commented or reacted. She opened his Instagram, same thing, photos of food, landscapes, some moments with work friends or college friends, but no photos of her, no mention of marriage, no posts celebrating wedding anniversaries. Michelle felt a tightness in her chest. She remembered her own social media, full of photos of the two of them, loving posts about her husband, celebrations of special dates. Meanwhile, on Brian's profile, she simply didn't exist. She checked his relationship status on Facebook. It was blank. It didn't say married, it didn't say single, it said nothing, as if he had deliberately chosen to keep this information secret. Michelle clicked on the About tab of his profile. In the personal information section, there was no mention of her, no reference to marriage. It was as if Brian had created an online version of himself where Michelle didn't exist. She opened his friends list and began checking the profiles of some work colleagues she recognized by names that Brian occasionally mentioned. Most of them had family photos, posts about wives and children, celebrations of wedding anniversaries. It was normal. It was what married people did on social media. They shared life with their partner, showed pride in their family, celebrated important moments together. But Brian didn't do any of that. Michelle went back to his profile and began looking at comments and likes on old posts. She noticed that several women frequently interacted with his posts, leaving comments and emojis, some she didn't know. A woman named Sarah seemed especially active, always liking and commenting on Brian's posts. Michelle clicked on her profile. Sarah worked at Tech Solutions. She was pretty, appeared to be around 30, and from her profile, she was single. Michelle felt a pang of something she couldn't identify: jealousy, suspicion, or just confirmation that Brian maintained social relationships with single women who didn't know he was married. She closed the laptop and sat at the kitchen table, processing what she had discovered. Brian had created an online presence completely disconnected from his real life. To anyone looking at his profile, he appeared to be a single, successful, available man. Michelle looked at her own hands. They were trembling slightly. With each discovery, the image she had of their marriage was crumbling a little more. It wasn't just that Brian hid her from work. It wasn't just that he never introduced her as his wife at social events. He had systematically erased any online evidence that he was a married man. Michelle wondered how many people in Brian's life knew he was married. From the profiles she had seen, it seemed the answer was very few. She looked at the clock. Brian would arrive in 2 hours. This time, she was determined to get answers. But first, she needed to better understand what she was discovering. If Brian hid the marriage online, what other areas of his life were kept secret? And more importantly, why would someone make so much effort to hide a wife? On Tuesday morning, Michelle was still processing the discoveries about Brian's social media when she received an unexpected call from her friend Lisa, who worked at a consulting company downtown. "Michelle, I was thinking about you yesterday." "Hi, Lisa. Why?" "I met your husband at a networking event on Monday. What a small world." Michelle felt her heart race. "You met Brian?" "Yes, it was at a Financial Professionals Association event. He was there representing Tech Solutions. Nice guy. Very professional." Michelle was silent for a moment. Brian hadn't mentioned anything about a networking event on Monday. "Lisa, what did you two talk about?" "Oh, mostly about work. He gave me his card, said the company was looking for partners for some projects. We talked about possible collaborations." "And did he mention anything about being married?" There was a pause on the other side of the line. "Actually, no. Why do you ask?" Michelle felt the ground collapse beneath her feet. "He didn't mention he had a wife." "No, he didn't mention it. Actually, now that you bring that up," Lisa hesitated. "There was a moment when a colleague of his came over and started talking to him. She was very close, touching his arm, laughing a lot at his jokes, and he didn't seem bothered." "What do you mean close?" "Like flirting, really." And Michelle, she clearly thought he was available. A married woman doesn't act like that with a man she knows has a wife. Michelle felt nauseous. "Do you remember her name?" "I think it was Sarah. Sarah something." Sarah, the same Sarah who liked all of Brian's posts on social media. "Michelle, are you okay? You sound strange." "Lisa, a question. If you didn't know Brian was married to me, what would your impression of him be?" Lisa thought for a moment. "Well, he seemed like a single guy, successful, charming." "Why are you asking this?" "Just curious," Michelle lied. "Lisa, can you do me a favor? If you run into Brian at an event like that again, can you pay attention to how he behaves?" "Michelle, what's going on?" "Maybe nothing. Just let me know if you notice anything strange, okay?" After she hung up, Michelle stood in the kitchen trying to organize her thoughts. Brian had gone to a networking event on Monday, and not only omitted that he was married, but apparently allowed a work colleague to flirt with him openly. Michelle picked up the phone again and called another friend, Carol, who worked in marketing and attended many professional events. Carol, have you ever seen Brian at a work event? Yes, a few times. Why? How does he behave at those events? Well, he's pretty sociable, talks to everyone. Why are you asking? Has he ever mentioned he's married when you've seen him at those events? Carol was silent for a moment. You know, Michelle, now that you're asking me. No, I never heard him mention it. And look, at networking events, it's super common for people to talk about family, spouses. It's part of social conversation. And did you find that strange? At the time, I didn't think much about it, but now that you're asking, yes, it's kind of strange. Most married men mention their wife at least once during a long conversation. Michelle thanked her and hung up. Another confirmation that Brian kept his personal life completely separate from his professional life. She looked at the wedding ring on her finger. For 5 years, she had worn that ring with pride, thinking Brian did the same. But now she wondered if he saw the ring as a burden, something that prevented him from being who he wanted to be in public. Michelle sat at the kitchen table and tried to imagine what it would be like to discover that her husband flirted with work colleagues who didn't know he was married. What it would be like to know that he participated in social events acting as if he were single. The reality was becoming increasingly clear and more painful. Brian wasn't just hiding the marriage because he was reserved. He was hiding the marriage because he wanted to benefit from being perceived as a single and available man. The question that now hammered in Michelle's mind was, how far did this charade go? And how many other people were being deceived along with her? Have you ever discovered that your partner behaves completely differently when you're not around? How would you handle it if you knew that the person you're married to allows others to believe they're available? Tell me in the comments, because sometimes discovering the truth about who the person we love really is can be the most painful and liberating thing at the same time. On Wednesday afternoon, Michelle was grocery shopping when she accidentally bumped into a man in the dairy section. Sorry, she said, helping to pick up the items that fell. And no problem, the man smiled. Aren't you Michelle? I think we met at Jennifer's birthday party last year. Michelle vaguely remembered. Jennifer was an old college colleague who threw huge parties where she met lots of people. Oh yes, David, right? That's right. How are you? Good, thank you. And you? Great. Actually, what a funny coincidence. David laughed. I think I work at the same company as your husband. Michelle felt her heart race. Really? Yes, Tech Solutions. I joined the finance department a few months ago, and there's a guy there named Brian Johnson. When I saw his last name, I remembered you had mentioned at the party that you were married to a Brian Johnson. Wow, what a coincidence. Right? I tried to make conversation with him a few times, mentioned that I knew a Michelle Johnson, but he always changed the subject. David seemed confused. It's strange, because normally when you mention that you know someone's wife, the person gets excited to talk. Michelle felt a chill in her stomach. He changed the subject. Yes, always. I thought it was weird. I thought maybe you two were going through some problem or something like that. And how long have you been working together? A few months. He seems like a nice guy, but very reserved. Never talks about personal life. Michelle forced a smile. Oh, he's always been like that. Reserved. Yeah, must be it. David laughed. Well, I'll try to strike up a conversation with him again. Now that I've confirmed you're married, I can mention that I ran into you here. Sure, Michelle lied. After David walked away, Michelle abandoned her shopping and left the supermarket. In the car, she processed what she had discovered. Brian didn't just omit that he was married. When someone mentioned knowing his wife, he actively changed the subject to avoid the conversation. This meant that hiding the marriage wasn't something passive or due to shyness. It was something active, deliberate, calculated. Michelle drove home with one question hammering in her mind. What kind of man makes so much effort to hide his own wife? That night, Michelle could barely sleep. The discoveries of the past few days were spinning in her mind like a hurricane. When Brian came home from work, she pretended normalcy. But inside, she was boiling with anger and confusion. On Thursday morning, after Brian left for work, Michelle made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't live in uncertainty anymore. She needed to see with her own eyes how Brian behaved in the work environment. Michelle dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue dress that made her feel confident. She applied careful makeup and checked the Tech Solutions address on GPS. It was only 20 minutes by car to downtown. The plan was simple. She would show up at his office as a romantic surprise. She would say she was passing through the area and decided to invite him to lunch. It was something any loving wife would do. If Brian really had nothing to hide, he would be happy with the surprise. But if her suspicions were correct, his reaction would be revealing. Michelle drove through the downtown streets with her heart racing. Part of her still hoped she was wrong about everything. Maybe Brian was just extremely reserved. Maybe she was seeing problems where none existed. But the other part of her, the part that had connected all the dots from the recent discoveries, knew she was about to confirm her worst fears. She parked in front of the Tech Solutions building, a modern 15-story glass and steel structure. She checked her makeup in the rearview mirror, took a deep breath and got out of the car. The reception was elegant, with black leather sofas and a large marble table. The receptionist, a young woman with blonde hair, smiled when Michelle approached. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "Good morning. I'd like to speak with Brian Johnson from the finance department." "Of course. May I ask who's looking for him?" Michelle hesitated for a second. "I'm Michelle, his wife." The receptionist's expression changed slightly. She seemed genuinely surprised. "Wife? Yes." Michelle felt a tightness in her chest. Even the receptionist didn't know Brian was married. "One moment, please." The receptionist picked up the phone. "Brian? There's a Michelle here at reception. She said she's your wife?" Michelle could hear Brian's voice on the other side of the line, but couldn't understand the words. What she understood was the tone. Absolute panic. "Can you wait a moment? He'll be right down," the receptionist said. But her smile now seemed forced. Michelle sat on one of the sofas, trying to maintain her composure. Some employees passed through the lobby, talking among themselves. She wondered how many of them knew Brian and how many knew he was married. 5 minutes later, the elevator doors opened and Brian appeared. Michelle had never seen her husband with that expression before. He looked nervous, almost panicked, like someone who had been caught doing something wrong. "Michelle." Brian approached quickly. "What are you doing here?" "Hi, honey." Michelle stood up and gave him a kiss on the cheek, noticing how tense he became. "I was passing through the area and thought I'd surprise you. How about we have lunch together?" I can't right now. I'm in the middle of a very important meeting." "That's okay. I can wait." Michelle smiled, but was observing every micro-expression on his face. "Actually, Michelle, I think it's better not to. It's just that—" Brian looked around nervously. "The company has policies about personal visits during work hours." Michelle felt a stab in her chest. Policies about personal visits. "Yeah, you know how rigid these companies are? Brian, I'm your wife, not just any personal visitor." At that moment, a woman approached. She was pretty, blonde, wore an elegant suit and smiled very familiarly at Brian. "Hi, Brian. Is everything okay?" The woman looked curiously at Michelle. Brian seemed even more nervous. "Sarah, this is Michelle." Sarah extended her hand. "Nice to meet you, Michelle. How do you two know each other?" Michelle looked at Brian, expecting him to answer. The silence stretched for a few seconds that seemed eternal. "We're friends," Brian finally said. Michelle felt like she had been slapped in the face. Friends. In front of a work colleague, Brian had referred to his own wife as a friend. "How nice," Sarah smiled. "Brian never mentions his friends. He's so reserved." "He really is," Michelle replied, her voice coming out colder than intended. "Well, I don't want to interrupt you two. Brian, don't forget the meeting at 2. Sarah walked away, but Michelle noticed how she briefly touched Brian's arm as she passed. When they were alone again, Michelle looked directly into Brian's eyes. "Friends." Her voice was low, but loaded with pain and anger. "Michelle, I can explain." "Explain what?" "How you just denied that I'm your wife in front of a colleague." "It wasn't that." "It wasn't." Michelle approached him. Then what was it, Brian? Why couldn't you say I'm your wife? Brian looked around, clearly uncomfortable with the possibility of someone overhearing the conversation. Look, can we talk about this at home? Now isn't the time? Now is exactly the time, Michelle said, her voice rising slightly. Because I finally understand everything. Michelle, please? You're ashamed of me, she said. And the words came out as a painful statement, not as a question. I'm not ashamed of you. Then why did you just introduce me as a friend to your colleague? Why do you never mention you're married? Why don't your work colleagues know you have a wife? Brian remained silent, and Michelle saw confirmation of all her fears in his eyes. 5 years, Brian. 5 years hiding that I'm your wife. She turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Brian standing in the middle of the lobby like a man who had lost everything. In the car, Michelle finally allowed the tears to come. They weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of anger, humiliation, liberation. Finally, she had the proof she needed. Have you ever felt invisible in the life of someone you love? Tell me in the comments how you would handle a situation like this, because Michelle's story will show that sometimes the most painful truth is also the most liberating. Michelle drove home with tears streaming down her face. Brian's words echoed in her mind, like a painful echo. This is Michelle. We're friends. 5 years of marriage reduced to a casual lie spoken without hesitation. When she got home, Michelle sat on the living room sofa and let reality finally sink in. These were no longer suspicions or clues. It was the naked truth. Brian was ashamed of being married to her, so much so that he was capable of denying the marriage in front of a work colleague, looking directly into her eyes. Michelle picked up the phone and called Jessica. Jess, are you busy? Never for you. What happened? Your voice sounds strange. Can you come over? I need to talk to someone. 20 minutes later, Jessica was sitting next to Michelle in the living room, listening to the whole story of the past few days. The shocked expression on her friend's face mirrored the pain that Michelle felt. He said you were friends, Jessica repeated, incredulous, in front of Sarah, the same Sarah who flirts with him on social media. Michelle, this is too much humiliation. No woman deserves to be treated like this. I know. Michelle wiped away another tear. But you know what's worse? I still have doubts about whether I'm overreacting. Overreacting. Jessica looked at her as if she had gone crazy. Michelle, your husband denied that you're married in front of a colleague. How can that be an overreaction? It's just that it's 5 years, Jess. 5 years of my life. What if I'm interpreting everything wrong? Jessica held Michelle's hands. Girl, you need to stop trying to justify his behavior. A man who loves his wife doesn't do this. Michelle remained silent, processing her friend's words. What are you going to do? Jessica asked gently. I don't know. Michelle sighed. Part of me wants to confront him tonight when he gets home. But another part wants more proof. What kind of proof? Michelle looked at Jessica with a determination that surprised herself. The company party? The party he canceled you from? Exactly. I'm thinking of showing up there. Jessica's eyes widened. Show up how? Without an invitation. I want to see how he behaves when he thinks I'm at home, not suspecting anything. I want to see his true face. Michelle, this could be very painful. More painful than living a lie. Michelle stood up and began pacing around the room. Jess, I need to know. I need to see with my own eyes how far this charade goes. And if it's exactly what you're thinking? Michelle stopped pacing and looked at her friend. Then at least I'll be sure, and I'll be able to make a decision based on the truth, not on suspicions. Jessica nodded slowly. Do you want me to go with you? No. This is something I need to do alone. That night, when Brian came home from work, he seemed nervous and avoided Michelle's gaze. She pretended to be watching television while he showered and ate dinner in silence. Michelle, Brian finally said, about this morning. About what? Michelle asked, without taking her eyes off the TV. You showing up at my work? It was unexpected. Unexpected that your wife wanted to have lunch with you. Brian was silent for a moment. It's just that at work, I keep things professional, separate from personal life. I see. Michelle finally looked at him. And I'm too personal to be mentioned. It's not that. Then what is it, Brian? Why did you say we were friends? I didn't say that. Yes, you did. In front of Sarah. We're friends. Those were your exact words. Brian ran his hand through his hair, that nervous gesture she knew well. It was just to avoid embarrassment. Embarrassment about what? About admitting you're married. Michelle, you're complicating a simple situation. Simple? Michelle stood up. There's nothing simple about denying you're married, Brian. They went to bed without resolving anything. Brian pretended to fall asleep quickly, but Michelle knew he was pretending by his irregular breathing. In the darkness of the room, Michelle made her final decision. She would go to that party. She would see Brian in action when he thought he was safe. And finally, she would have all the answers she needed. The truth, however painful it might be, would be better than living in uncertainty. Saturday arrived with a light rain that mirrored Michelle's somber mood. Brian left home at 5 in the afternoon, saying he would go straight to the party. He kissed her cheek casually, as he always did, not knowing it would be the last time he could maintain his charade. Michelle waited 2 hours before getting ready. She chose an elegant black dress, the same one she had worn to a friend's wedding the year before. She remembered how Brian had complimented how beautiful she looked that night. Now, the same dress would be her armor for the battle she was about to fight. The Marriott Hotel was illuminated and festive when Michelle arrived. She parked and stayed in the car for a few minutes, breathing deeply and preparing herself mentally. There was no going back. After tonight, her life would change forever. Michelle entered the hotel and followed the signs indicating the Tech Solutions Party Hall. Fortunately, the event was semi-open at the hotel, with people freely entering and leaving the main hall. She managed to enter without needing to show an invitation or identify herself. The music and voices of the guests could be heard from the hallway. She stopped at the entrance to the hall and observed the scene. There were about 100 people, all well-dressed, talking in groups scattered around the hall. Round tables decorated with flower arrangements, a bar in the back, and a small dance floor where some couples were moving. Michelle quickly located Brian. He was near the bar, talking animatedly with a group of people, and beside him, laughing at something he had said, was Sarah. Michelle positioned herself behind a decorative column from where she could observe without being seen. What she witnessed in the following minutes confirmed all her worst fears. Brian and Sarah were clearly flirting. She constantly touched his arm. He smiled in a way Michelle recognized. It was the same smile he used to give her at the beginning of their relationship. Sarah leaned close to him when she spoke, and Brian didn't pull away. "Brian, you're terrible today," Sarah laughed, giving him a playful tap on the chest. "I didn't know you were so funny." "You bring out the best in me," Brian replied, and Michelle felt like she had been punched in the stomach. They were openly flirting, like a couple at the beginning of a romance, and everyone around seemed to find it perfectly normal. Michelle moved closer, staying behind another group of people, trying to hear the conversations better. "Brian, you have to tell me your secret," said a gray-haired man. "How do you manage to always be so calm? No pressure from a wife? No domestic drama?" Michelle felt her blood freeze. The man was clearly assuming Brian was single. "It's just a matter of priorities," Brian replied with a smile. "Focus on work and fun in free time." "I envy you, man," the man continued. "I love my wife, but sometimes I think about what it would be like to have the freedom of a bachelor again." Sarah moved closer to Brian. "Well, I think Brian is very demanding. Someday he'll find someone special." "Maybe I already have," Brian said, looking directly at Sarah. Michelle had to lean against the wall. Her husband was flirting with another woman in front of dozens of colleagues, all believing he was single and available. She continued observing for a few more minutes. Each interaction confirmed what she already knew. Brian wasn't just omissive about marriage. He actively cultivated the image of a single man. A waiter approached the group offering drinks. Sarah took a champagne flute and raised it in the air. "A toast to our company's most coveted bachelor," she said, looking at Brian. Everyone laughed and raised their glasses. Brian smiled and toasted along with the others. Most coveted bachelor. The words echoed in Michelle's mind like a death sentence for their marriage. Michelle moved away from the group and went to the women's restroom. She needed a moment to process what she had seen. In the mirror, she saw a woman who had been completely erased from her husband's life. 5 years of marriage, and she was a ghost. But as she looked at her reflection, Michelle felt something changing inside her. The pain was giving way to anger. The humiliation was transforming into determination. She would no longer be anyone's shameful secret. She would no longer be the invisible wife. Michelle touched up her lipstick, raised her chin, and left the bathroom. It was time for Brian to discover that his double life had come to an end. Have you ever felt completely erased from the life of someone who should love you? Tell me in the comments how you would react in this situation. Michelle left the bathroom with firm and determined steps. She had observed enough. She had seen Brian flirting with Sarah, had heard colleagues referring to him as most coveted bachelor, had witnessed him actively lying about his personal life. Now, it was time to end that charade. Michelle walked through the hall toward the group where Brian was. Some people looked at her with curiosity. After all, she was a new face at the party. But Michelle maintained her confident posture, chin raised, like a woman who had every right to be there. When she got close to the group, Michelle stopped and waited a moment. Brian had his back to her, telling a funny story about something that had happened at the office. Sarah was laughing loudly, touching his arm again. And that's when I told the client. Brian continued his story, completely oblivious to his wife's presence. Michelle took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Hi, honey." Her voice cut through the conversation like a blade. Brian turned slowly, and Michelle saw all the color drain from his face. His eyes widened in absolute panic. "Michelle?" Brian whispered, as if he were seeing a ghost. "Surprise!" Michelle smiled, but it was an icy smile. "I thought I'd show up at your company party. You know, as your wife." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the group looked from Brian to Michelle, trying to process what had just happened. Sarah was the first to recover from the shock. "Wife?" she repeated, her voice coming out louder than intended. "Yes." Michelle extended her hand to Sarah. "Michelle Johnson, married to Brian for 5 years." Sarah looked at the extended hand as if it were something poisonous. She didn't shake it. 5 years? The gray-haired man who had earlier made the comment about Brian being single now looked at him with a confused expression. Brian, you've been married for 5 years." Brian opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water. Yes, we're married," Michelle answered for him, her voice clear and firm. "Actually, I'm curious. How many of you knew Brian was married?" She looked around the group. Confused faces, exchanged glances, embarrassing silence. No one raised their hand. No one said a word. "Interesting," Michelle continued. "And 5 years of marriage, and none of his colleagues knew. I wonder why." "Michelle, please." Brian finally found his voice. "It's not what you're thinking." "It's not." Michelle turned to him. "Then explain it to me. Brian, explain to me how your colleagues don't know you're married. Explain to me how Sarah here was flirting with you thinking you were single." "I wasn't flirting," Sarah protested, but her voice came out weak. "You weren't." Michelle looked at her. "Then how do you explain toasting to the company's most coveted bachelor 10 minutes ago?" Sarah paled. "Michelle, let's talk privately." Brian tried to grab her arm, but Michelle pulled away. "No. 5 years talking privately and you lying. Now we're going to talk here, in front of everyone." More people began to approach, attracted by the commotion. Michelle could see whispers spreading through the hall. "Brian," the gray-haired man said slowly, "did you really never mention you were married?" Brian looked around, seeing there was no escape. "It's complicated." "Complicated?" Michelle laughed, but there was no humor in the laugh. "What's complicated about saying, 'I'm married'? You don't understand the pressure in the work environment." "Pressure?" Michelle approached him. "What pressure?" The pressure of admitting you have a wife who loves you. Michelle, please, don't do this here. Do what? Exist? Her voice rose. Because that's what you've been trying to prevent for 5 years, isn't it? For me to exist in your life. The entire hall was paying attention now. Conversations stopped. People approached. Even the music seemed quieter. 5 years, Michelle continued, her voice loaded with pain and anger. 5 years being treated like a shameful secret. 5 years being erased from your life as if I were a mistake you wanted to hide. It's not like that. Yes, it is, Michelle exploded. It's exactly like that. You're ashamed of being married to me. So ashamed that you build an entire life pretending to be single. Brian looked around, seeing dozens of colleagues watching the public collapse of his world of lies. Did you know, Michelle addressed the people around them, that Brian goes to networking events and lets women flirt with him because they think he's available? Did you know that when someone mentions knowing his wife, he changes the subject? Murmurs of shock spread through the crowd. Michelle, stop, Brian begged. No. Michelle looked directly into his eyes. I'm not going to stop anymore. I'm not going to be invisible anymore. I'm not going to accept being treated as if I don't exist anymore. She took off her wedding ring and placed it on the table next to them. Congratulations, Brian. Now you can officially be the bachelor you always pretended to be. Michelle turned and walked toward the exit, leaving a deadly silence in the hall. Brian called her name, but she didn't look back. Outside the hotel, Michelle breathed the cold night air. For the first time in 5 years, she felt free. Free from the lie. Free from the humiliation. Free from being someone's shameful secret. Michelle got in the car and drove home, knowing she would never again be the same person who entered that hall, and being grateful for that. 6 months later, Michelle was in her new apartment, organizing the last boxes from the move. The divorce had been finalized the week before, and she finally felt like she owned her own life again. The decision to separate from Brian wasn't easy, but it was the most liberating one she had ever made. In the days following the company party, Brian tried everything to convince her not to leave him. He promised changes, apologized, begged for another chance. But Michelle had seen the truth. And once you see who a person really is, there's no going back. The divorce process revealed even more lies. Brian had bank accounts Michelle didn't know about, had taken trips he said were for work and weren't, and had cultivated relationships she never knew existed. His double life was even more elaborate than she had imagined. Michelle discovered she wasn't the first person to suspect Brian's behavior. Several of his female colleagues approached her after the party, telling stories of how Brian flirted and implied he was available. Sarah, in fact, had ended a relationship believing she had a chance with Brian. The public humiliation of that night was devastating for Brian. He resigned from Tech Solutions 2 weeks later, unable to face the colleagues who witnessed the collapse of his charade. Michelle learned from friends that he had moved to another city. But for Michelle, that night was the beginning of a new life. She went back to studying, took a specialization course in marketing, and got a job at a company where she was valued and respected. She made new friends, rediscovered hobbies she had abandoned, and most importantly, learned to trust her own intuition again. Michelle looked at the photo from the graduation party of her specialization course on the coffee table. She was radiant, surrounded by colleagues who had become great friends. People who truly knew her, who celebrated her achievements, who included her in their lives. For the first time in years, Michelle felt seen. She felt important. She felt worthy of true love. The most valuable lesson Michelle learned was that our intuition rarely deceives us. When something doesn't seem right in a relationship, it probably really isn't right. The signs were all there, the vague introductions, the absence on social media, the isolation from his professional life. Michelle had just normalized behaviors that should never be normal. She also learned that we shouldn't accept crumbs of love from anyone. A partner who truly loves us wants the whole world to know we're together. They want to include us in all parts of their life, want to celebrate the relationship, want to make us feel proud to be by their side. Anything less than that isn't true love. Michelle picked up her phone and opened the comment section of a post she had made about new beginnings. Messages from women who had been through similar situations, who also found strength to change their lives. Thank you for sharing your story. It gave me courage to confront my husband about strange behaviors. Your story saved me from a marriage that was destroying me inside. Michelle smiled. If her pain had helped other women find their own strength, then everything had been given new meaning. The moral of Michelle's story is clear. Never accept being anyone's secret. Never allow someone to make you feel like you're a mistake to be hidden. You deserve a love that shouts your name to the world. And you, who are watching this story, have you stopped to analyze how your partner treats you in public? How they talk about you to other people? If you're feeling something isn't right, trust your intuition. It might be trying to save you from years of pain. Tell me in the comments, what warning signs would you never ignore again in a relationship? Your experience can help other people recognize similar situations. And if this story touched you in some way, if it made you reflect on your own life, leave a like on the video, subscribe to our channel, and activate notifications. We have many other stories that can inspire you to live the life you truly deserve. Remember, you should never be erased from the life of someone who claims to love you.